The rain over Chicago was not a gentle drizzle. It was a relentless, icy downpour that turned the city into a blur of gray steel and shimmering, wet asphalt. It was the kind of rain that seeped through the seams of your shoes and chilled you to the bone. A rain that felt personal, as if it had chosen you specifically to punish. For Mateo, huddled under the meager awning of a closed laundromat, it was just another layer of difficulty in a life that seemed to be made of them. His worn denim jacket was soaked through, offering no warmth against the biting wind. He shifted his weight, the damp cardboard sign in his hands feeling heavier with each passing minute. "We'll work for food," it read, the words slightly blurred from the weather. His dark eyes, usually warm and expressive, were shadowed with a fatigue that went deeper than physical tiredness. It was the fatigue of the invisible, of the man no one sees. Each car that splashed through the puddle near the curb was a reminder of his invisibility. The drivers, safe in their dry, warm cocoons, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of dashboards, would glance his way, their eyes meeting his for a fleeting second before looking straight ahead, accelerating just a little faster. He didn't blame them, not really. He understood the economy of compassion. Sometimes, people have so little to spare, they have to guard it closely. He thought of his daughter, Elena, back in a small village in Puebla. Her photograph, tucked safely in a plastic bag in his inner pocket, was his talisman. Her smile, a beacon across thousands of miles, was the fuel that kept him standing in the freezing rain. He needed to wire money home by the end of the week. His rent for the tiny single room he shared with 3 other men was due. The fear was a constant, cold knot in his stomach, tighter and more persistent than the chill from the rain. He watched the rhythm of the traffic lights change. Red, yellow, green, a cycle of stopped and going that he felt stuck outside of. This was his life. A relentless waiting for a break that never seemed to come, a hope that felt more like a prayer whispered into a storm. The sound of the rain was a drumbeat of despair, and with each drop that found its way down his collar, Mateo felt a little smaller, a little more alone in the vast, indifferent city. Just as Mateo was considering giving up, surrendering to the damp cold, and the long walk back to his cramped room, he saw him. An old man, easily in his 80s, was struggling on the slick sidewalk across the street. He was well dressed in a tweed overcoat, but he leaned heavily on a polished wooden cane, his steps painfully slow and uncertain. The wind whipped at him, turning his umbrella inside out with a sudden, violent gust. The old man stumbled, his cane skidding on the wet pavement, and he fell to one knee with a sharp cry of pain that Mateo could hear even over the roar of the rain and traffic. It was a moment frozen in time. Pedrians hurried past, their heads down, their own destinations more important than the plight of a fallen stranger. But Mateo didn't think. He didn't calculate the cost, the time, or the fact that he was already soaked and exhausted. His body moved before his mind could process it. He dropped his cardboard sign, which was immediately claimed by a stream of water, and dashed across the street, ignoring the honk of a taxi as he jaywalked. "Señor. Señor, está bien," he said, his voice laced with genuine concern as he knelt beside the man. The old man looked up, his face pale and etched with pain, his blue eyes wide with shock and embarrassment. My leg," he gasped. "It's my hip. It just gave way." Mateo's hands were gentle but firm. "It's okay. I help you. We get you out of the rain." He carefully looped the man's arm over his own shoulders, taking the weight. He was surprisingly strong for his slender frame, strength forged from years of manual labor. He helped the old man to his feet, retrieved the broken umbrella, and together, they began a slow, shuffling journey towards the nearby bus stop, which offered a slightly larger shelter. "Thank you, young man," the old man whispered, his voice trembling. Everyone just walked by. Mateo just nodded, his focus on keeping the man steady. He didn't see this as heroism. He saw it as humanity. It was what his abuela had always taught him. You help those who need it, because someday, you will be the one who needs help. Once the old man, whose name was Arthur, was safely seated on the bench under the bus shelter, Mateo stayed. He could have left then, his good deed done, but he saw the lingering pain in Arthur's eyes and the way his hands shook. So he remained, standing protectively nearby, a silent guardian in a sodden denim jacket. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the patter of rain on the plexiglass roof. Arthur finally spoke, his voice steadier now. I live just a few blocks from here. I was just going to the pharmacy. Foolish, in this weather. Mateo simply smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached his eyes. The rain is no good for walking. Arthur studied him then, really studied him. He saw the kindness in Mateo's face, the dignity that clung to him despite his circumstances. He noticed the absence of the cardboard sign. You were working over there? He asked gently. Mateo's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of quiet resignation. He nodded. I look for work. It is difficult sometimes. He didn't elaborate. He didn't talk about the fear of immigration officials, or the employers who paid less than promised, or the constant ache of missing his daughter. The bus arrived with a hiss of air brakes, its interior lights a golden invitation. Mateo helped Arthur board, making sure the driver knew which stop the old man needed. Thank you, Arthur said again, his hand gripping Mateo's arm with a surprising strength. I won't forget this. Mateo just nodded again. Cuídese, señor. Take care. He stepped back onto the curb, watching as the bus pulled away, Arthur's grateful face visible for a moment in the window, before it disappeared into the gray sheet of rain. The brief connection was over. Mateo was alone again. The adrenaline faded, and the cold and dampness returned with a vengeance. He trudged back to his spot, but his sign was gone, washed away. It felt like a sign itself. Defeated, his shoulders slumped, he began the long, wet walk home. The memory of Arthur's gratitude a small, fading ember of warmth in the overwhelming cold of his reality. The next morning, the city was reborn. The storm had scrubbed the sky a brilliant, impossible blue, and the sun glittered off the remaining puddles, turning them into scattered mirrors. For Mateo, however, the clear sky did little to lift the gloom in his heart. He was back on the same corner, having fashioned a new, slightly less soggy cardboard sign. The events of the previous day felt like a dream, a small, surreal interruption in the monotonous struggle of his life. He replayed it in his mind. The old man's fall, the feel of his weight on his shoulders, the sincere thanks. It had felt good to be seen, not as a problem or a shadow, but as a person. But that feeling was fleeting. The practical, worried part of his brain took over. He had lost half a day's potential work yesterday. He had nothing to show for it, but a cold that was starting to tickle his throat. The rent was still due. The money for Elena was still unwired. Hope, he thought, was a dangerous thing. It was a tiny crack of light that made the surrounding darkness seem even more profound. He tried to push the memory of Arthur from his mind, to focus on the cars, on making eye contact, on projecting a willingness to work that was so strong someone would have to notice. He thought of the other men in his room, their similar stories of near misses and broken promises. This was his reality. Kindness didn't pay the bills. A part of him, a small, childish part, wondered if the old man would return. Maybe he would bring him a hot coffee as a thank you. The thought was immediately followed by a wave of self-reproach. Don't be foolish, Mateo. The world doesn't work that way. The man was grateful, and that was the end of it. People move on. They have their own lives, their own problems, far removed from the struggles of a wet immigrant on a street corner. He shoved his hands deeper into his pockets, the rough texture of the cardboard a familiar sensation against his work-roughened fingers. The sun was warm on his face, but it couldn't melt the ice of anxiety forming in his chest. Today felt heavier than yesterday, the weight of his responsibilities pressing down on him with renewed force. It was mid-morning when a car, an elegant, older but impeccably maintained Mercedes, pulled over to the curb right in front of him. It wasn't the aggressive swerve of a taxi, but a smooth, deliberate stop. Mateo's heart gave a little jump, a reflex of someone always waiting for the worst. Was it immigration? The police? But the man who got out was Arthur. He moved more easily today, though he still used his cane. He was dressed in a smart, casual sweater and slacks, and his face broke into a warm, relieved smile when he saw Mateo. "There you are," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp air. "I was hoping I'd find you." Mateo was stunned. He stood up straighter, his own cautious smile appearing. "Señor Artur? You are. you are walking better. Thanks to you, Arthur said, approaching him. He didn't just look better physically, he seemed lighter, his eyes brighter. He extended his hand, and when Matteo shook it, he was surprised by the firm, confident grip. I meant what I said yesterday. I won't forget what you did. Not everyone would have helped. In fact, almost no one did. Matteo shrugged, a little embarrassed by the direct praise. It was the right thing to do. It was a human thing to do, Arthur corrected him gently. And in my experience, that's becoming rarer and rarer. He looked around at the busy street, then back at Matteo, his gaze taking in the cardboard sign, the worn jacket, the tired but proud posture. I didn't just come to thank you, Matteo. I came to make you an offer. A proper one. He paused, letting his words hang in the air. How would you like a real job? A steady one. With a fair wage. The world seemed to slow down. The sounds of the traffic faded into a dull hum. Matteo could only stare, his mind struggling to process the words. A job. A real job. The words were so simple, yet they carried the weight of a miracle. He felt a tremble start in his hands, a surge of emotion so powerful it threatened to overwhelm him right there on the street corner. A job? Matteo finally managed to whisper, the words feeling foreign and miraculous on his tongue. He searched Arthur's face for any sign of a joke, but found only earnest sincerity. But, what can I do? I am strong, I work hard, but I have no papers. He said the last word quietly, a confession of his greatest vulnerability. Arthur's expression didn't change. He nodded slowly, understandingly. We can discuss all that. The legality, we will handle. I have a lawyer. But first, let's get out of this street. Come, have lunch with me. Let's talk. He gestured towards his car. For a moment, Matteo was paralyzed by a lifetime of caution. Get in a stranger's car? Trust a promise that seemed too good to be true? But then he looked into Arthur's eyes. They were the eyes of his late grandfather, kind and direct. This was not a stranger. This was the man whose dignity he had helped preserve in the rain. Swallowing his fear, Matteo nodded. Okay, he said, his voice thick with emotion. He picked up his small bag of belongings, the entirety of his life in this city, and followed Arthur to the car. The interior was clean and smelled of leather and old books. As Arthur drove, he began to talk. I live alone in an old house, too big for one person really. It was my family's home. It has a garden that has been neglected for years. I used to tend to it myself, but, he gestured to his hip. This doesn't allow for that kind of work anymore. I need a groundskeeper, someone with strong hands and a good heart. The pay is $25 an hour, to start. 40 hours a week. The numbers echoed in Matteo's mind, a sum he could barely comprehend. It was more than double what he made on his best days, and it was steady. It was security. He stared out the window as the city streets began to give way to tree-lined avenues with large, beautiful old homes. He was entering a different world, a world he had only ever seen from the outside. He wasn't just crossing the city. He felt like he was crossing the chasm between despair and hope. Arthur's house was not just a house. It was a grand, Victorian-style home with a wide porch and a sprawling, overgrown garden. It had a quiet, noble beauty, but also an air of profound loneliness. Inside it was the same, elegantly furnished, but filled with the silence of a place that had seen too little laughter in recent years. Arthur made them sandwiches, and they sat at a large wooden table in a sun-drenched kitchen. As they ate, Arthur began to open up. He spoke of his late wife, Eleanor, his voice softening with a love that had clearly never dimmed. He spoke of his son, a successful investment banker in New York, who visited only on major holidays. He calls every Sunday, Arthur said, a faint sadness in his eyes. But the house, it gets very quiet. Matteo listened, his own story feeling less heavy in the face of Arthur's solitude. He found himself speaking, too. He told Arthur about Elena, showing him the photograph that was now slightly damp at the edges. He spoke of his village, of his dreams for his daughter, of the fear that drove him to leave, and the hope that kept him going. He even spoke, haltingly, of the dangerous border crossing, the nights spent hiding, the constant undercurrent of fear. I just want her to have a chance, Matteo finished, his voice barely a whisper. A real chance. Arthur reached across the table and placed his weathered hand over Matteo's. So did I for my son, he said. And he has it. But in getting it, he lost something, I think. The understanding that we are all connected. You, Matteo, in helping a foolish old man in the rain, you showed me that connection still exists. In that moment, they were no longer an immigrant and an old man, a laborer and a homeowner. They were just two people, separated by age, culture, and circumstance, but united by a fundamental human need for connection and purpose. The job offer was no longer just charity. It was a pact, a mutual rescue. The following Monday, Matteo arrived at Arthur's house as the sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. He wore new work clothes that Arthur had insisted on buying for him. Sturdy boots, durable pants, thick gloves. The fear was still there, a nervous flutter in his stomach, but it was now mixed with a powerful, soaring hope. Arthur met him at the garden shed, which was filled with tools, all clean but showing their age. This, Arthur said with a grand gesture, is your new kingdom. It's a mess, I know. But with your youth and my slightly outdated knowledge, I think we can make it beautiful again. And so, they began. Matteo's first task was to clear the weeds that had choked the flower beds. He worked with a focused intensity, the physical labor a familiar and comforting rhythm. The earth smelled rich and alive. Arthur would sit on a porch chair, offering advice, telling stories about each plant, each tree. That rose bush, Eleanor planted that the year we were married. As Matteo worked, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. This wasn't just a job, it was creation. He was nurturing life, bringing order and beauty back to a forgotten place. He wasn't invisible here, he was essential. At the end of the day, his body ached with a pleasant, earned tiredness. Arthur came out with 2 glasses of lemonade. He handed one to Matteo and an envelope. Your first week's pay, he said. In advance. So you can send that money to your Elena. Matteo opened the envelope. The cash inside was more money than he had held at one time in his entire life in America. He looked from the money to Arthur, his eyes filling with tears that he didn't try to hide. Señor Artur. I. He couldn't form the words. Thank you, felt impossibly small. Arthur simply clapped him on the back. You earned it, Matteo. Now, let's talk about getting you a proper phone, so you can video call that beautiful daughter of yours. Weeks turned into months. The garden transformed under Matteo's care. Blooms exploded in a riot of color, where once there had only been tangled green. The grass was green and neatly trimmed, the hedges sculpted. The house itself seemed to stand taller, its windows shining, no longer looking out on neglect. But the change inside the house was even more profound. Matteo's presence filled the quiet spaces. He began to cook simple Mexican dishes for them to share, the aromas of cumin and cilantro bringing a new warmth to the old kitchen. Arthur taught him to play chess in the evenings, and Matteo, a quick learner, soon began to win. They were an odd pair, the young Mexican immigrant and the old American widower, but their bond was deep and real. One Saturday, Arthur's son, David, visited unexpectedly. He was a sharp, well-dressed man who seemed to carry the stress of Wall Street with him. He stood on the porch, staring in disbelief at the revitalized garden, at his father who was laughing genuinely at something Matteo had said. Dad? What's all this? He asked, his tone a mixture of confusion and suspicion. Arthur introduced them. David, this is Matteo. He's my groundskeeper and my friend. David was coldly polite, his lawyer's eyes assessing Matteo, looking for the angle. But later, as he saw the light in his father's eyes, the way the house felt alive again, his demeanor softened. He pulled Matteo aside. My father, he hasn't been this happy in years, David admitted, his voice low. Thank you. It was a small sentence, but from David, it felt like a monumental acceptance. The single act of kindness in the rain had not just changed 2 lives. It had begun to heal a family, bridging gaps that had been widening for years. The garden was a testament to that healing, a beautiful, living symbol of how one good deed can ripple outward, touching everything in its path. A year later, on a brilliant autumn day, the garden was the setting for a small, joyful celebration. Matteo stood near the very rose bush Arthur's wife had planted, but he wasn't alone. Holding his hand was his daughter, Elena, her face a perfect picture of wonder and happiness. The legal process, funded and supported by Arthur and his son, had been long and complex, but it had succeeded. Matteo had been granted legal status, and he had flown to Mexico to bring his daughter home. Their home. Arthur, looking healthier and stronger than he had in a decade, beamed with a grandfather's pride. He held out a hand to Elena, who shyly presented him with a drawing she had made of the garden. "For you, Abuelo Arthur," she said, using the title naturally, affectionately. Tears welled in the old man's eyes as he took it. The scene was a vibrant tapestry of everything that mattered: family, love, and second chances. Matteo looked around him, at his daughter, safe and laughing, at the beautiful home he now helped maintain, at Arthur, who was no longer his employer but his family. He thought back to that desperate, rain-soaked day on the corner, the cold fear, the feeling of invisibility. He had offered a simple act of kindness, with no expectation of reward. He had only hoped to help another human being in a moment of distress. That single decision, made from a place of innate empathy, had been the seed. This life, this profound happiness, was the harvest. The rain had ended, and in its place was a sun so warm, so bright, it felt like a blessing. He squeezed Elena's hand, his heart so full he thought it might burst. The journey had been long and hard, but he had finally, truly, arrived.